Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the unfinished work of decolonization and asking, what would a just post-colonial world look like? Hello, my name is Emily McTurnan, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by the author of a brand new book just published at Princeton University Press. This book offers us a reimagined ideal of global justice, drawing on anti-colonial thinkers to analyse the unfinished work of decolonization and to defend not a nationalist project, as you might have thought decolonization was, but instead a vision of global social equality. And the author is Dr. Xiaoqing Chen, an assistant professor in political theory here in the Department of Political Science. Regular listeners will, of course, recall Ying's other episodes with us on resisting colonialism and on the trouble with exporting Hollywood movies. And I'll link to those in the show notes in case you'd like to revisit them. So welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily.
So you open the book with a chapter titled Decolonization Unfinished. Great title. Tell us about the state of affairs that moved you to write the book.
Yeah, so I guess, one obvious state of affairs is that there is still an extreme amount of global inequality. And I'm not just talking about material inequality, though that's obviously at the backbone of it, but also in terms of political inequality. So, many post-colonial countries are still very much marginalized actors in global governance and international lawmaking and just a range of, global political issues. And we see this playing out in things like climate change and negotiations and so on and so forth, often because of the power inequality between, global North and global South actors. There are a lot of voices that are ignored or dismissed. And so, part of the motivation for thinking about this, what a really genuinely post-colonial world order will look like is to respond to these inequalities in power and material wealth.
Great. So let's dive into your theoretical framework and your central argument. And so what you're doing in the book is you take a set of anti-colonial thinkers and you find in them a thread of egalitarianism, and then you use this to create the positive vision. So let's take this in turn. So could you tell us first a bit about the anti-colonial thinkers who are shaping your work?
Yeah, so I look mainly at the work of four quite influential 20th century third world anti-colonial thinkers. So there's Frantz Fanon, who's obviously writing from the French Empire. There's his teacher, Césaire, who's also writing from the French Empire. And then there's Nehru, who was obviously the first prime minister of India and who was writing from the British Empire, and also Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister of Ghana, also writing from the first British Empire. So all four thinkers are kind of writing at the time when formal decolonization had not fully occurred yet, but they were all kind of standing at the threshold of this huge momentous historical change and, thinking about what a future kind of, just world, both in terms of their own society, but also the world order should look like.
And you're suggesting in the book, I take it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's wrong to take these thinkers primarily to be proposing a nationalist project. So why is that?
Yeah, so despite the fact that, many of these thinkers are known for their nationalism, if we take a sort of closer reading at their work and also just look at their actual political projects, the proposals and so on, so here I'm thinking of, for example, Césaire's initial political campaign was to push for departmentalization, which would mean that, former colonies become part of France to form a republic rather than an independent nation state, or Nkrumah's idea of an African Union, which would transcend national borders within Africa anyways. If you look at, their work and also their political projects, you see that often for them, the nation state was an instrument to resist the kind of colonial oppression that they were facing at the time, but they already kind of saw the limits of the nation state. So the Nkrumah saw that, without some kind of transnational economic and political union, Ghana would be a very small player economically and politically on the global stage. And this would allow for, the continuation of relationships of dependency that, like economic dependency that would keep being dependent on the global north and so on. And what he calls opening door to neocolonialism. And, Césaire, on the other hand, thought that if places like colonies like Martinique just became another quote unquote nation state, this would be letting the colonizer off the hook too easily, because now it would be much harder as a separate nation state to demand that the former colony can share in the wealth of the former colonizer. Whereas if they became a part of genuine Republic of France, then through standard redistribution and so on with it that happens within the nation state, there was hope that, the people that had bore the brunt of creating metropolitan wealth would be able to actually benefit from it. So there are many different ways in which then I think they saw the nation state as limited. And obviously, there are different views among the four of them, but I think that it's too simplistic to kind of attribute to them just because a formal decolonization did end up in a world of nation states to attribute to them retrospectively. That was the full vision of the full ambition of decolonization that they had in mind.
They sort of weren't limited to the thought that this nation state needed to be free of the colonizers. They actually wanted something quite different as a future world order beyond that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Great. So let's talk a little bit as well about the other thing you say. So you say a little bit about the nation state, and then, that's not the limit of it. But there's another thing you're pulling out of the anti-colonial thinkers that people maybe haven't paid enough attention to in your view yet. So not only are they not nationalists, but they're also egalitarians. So tell us about the threads of egalitarianism you pull out of their work.
Yeah, great. So in the book, I reconstruct their critique of colonialism as a critique not really of foreign rule, which might sound quite counterintuitive, but instead of racialized hierarchies of different kinds. And, one way to understand this is to think about the fact that, first of all four thinkers are to different degrees influenced by socialist thinking, and some of them are self-declared socialists. So for many of them, thinking about oppression as foreign, as the roots of oppression as being someone foreign, has a different ethno-cultural identity to you, oppressing you, is really insufficient, because for them, there could be, and Fanon and Nkrumah, they talk about this as well. There could be, and there are, domestic collaborators or even domestic sources of oppression. People like, as Fanon says, blacks that are whiter than whites, a very controversial way to put it. But there he's not making really a statement about, skin color or, racialized identities, making a statement about how some people who share your ethno-cultural identity actually occupy a social position that is quite similar to the foreigner. And so the hierarchies, the political, economic, and social hierarchies are at the center of their critique of what was wrong with colonialism. And so in order to decolonize fully, it's not enough to kick out the foreigners. It's really what they're after, essentially, is to dismantle these hierarchies and to create the material and social conditions that would allow for people to relate to each other as equals. And so this, I think, is a much more ambitious view, because it has implications for how the domestic political economy should be arranged, and sort of like cultural norms and so on, and how those need to be challenged as well. Again, beyond sort of changing the flag and claiming that now we're ruled by our own people.
So self-determination in this sense just isn't going to be enough to abolish the kinds of hierarchies these thinkers are concerned with.
Yeah, that's exactly right, yes.
Before we move to the fascinating way in which you then combine this with contemporary analytic political philosophy, just briefly, why these thinkers?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot. So, I mean, there are different reasons. I think one reason is just that, they're quite geographically varied. They're writing from different parts of the world. But then at the same time in their work, at least for me, I can trace overlapping critiques of colonialism and a vision for decolonization that centers around the value of equality. So it's interesting, I think, to take them as not full representatives of the anti-colonial tradition, obviously, but like pretty convincing, kind of data points as indicating a much richer anti-colonial tradition than the one that we've known. And also, because I was interested in certain specific issue areas. So in the book, I talk about international investment as a kind of neocolonial exploitation. I talk about unequal cultural flows between societies as a form of problematic cultural imperialism. And these thinkers are the ones that have something to say about, or, at least on my reconstruction, have something helpful, I think, to say about these specific issue areas. So yeah, the combination of, I guess, the fact that I think I can convincingly trace the sort of value of equality in their work, fact that they're quite geographically varied, and also the fact that they have something, I think, insightful to say about the specific areas I'm interested in.
Are other anti-colonial thinkers more nationalist, would you say? Are these like the egalitarian outliers, or do you see this as a more general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't say that. I think that they're outliers, but there's certainly, I think, some anti-colonial thinkers that it'd be hard to reinterpret them as, as moving away from cultural nationalists. So nationalism. So like being from a Chinese background, initially I wanted to, somehow fit a Chinese thinker in there, and I looked a lot at the work of Fan Qichao, and who's a very influential. I guess you could call him an anti-colonial thinker, but, he's much more of a kind of almost social Darwinian kind of like, our race is superior and therefore we deserve self-determination kind of figure. So there are definitely influential figures like that too. And I exclude them from my selection. The claim isn't that this is what anti-colonialism is about, but that there is a different way to think about anti-colonialism that's not limited to nationalism. And to me, it is independently attractive. And that's why I think it's worth thinking about.
Great. So let's get to the positive vision, which we set up nicely, right? So you're going to take this egalitarian thread and you're going to do something with it.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just ask a little bit about what they're adding to the discussion here. So I guess in our field, it's fair to say, I think nearly everyone reckons the current global order is unjust. And many people think huge redistribution would be required as part of the fixing of that injustice.
Mm-hmm.
But your book makes a fascinating intervention because it tells us that we're getting it a bit wrong in our standard way of thinking about global justice within philosophy. So what are we getting wrong before we get to how we're going to get it right using these anti-colonial thinkers?
Yeah, very big question, what we're getting wrong. I mean, one thing is just that, well, up until very recently, I think now there's a bit more diverse work on global justice, but up until recently, I think a lot of analytic political theory, philosophy on global justice was really kind of ahistorical. A lot of it is sort of, okay, there's a poor person, there's a rich person, or there's a rich population, a poor population. What do they owe each other? Or, I mean, not even reciprocally, just what do the rich owe the poor? And you see this in like very famous kind of standard global justice thought experiments, like the rescuing the child in the drowning pond that you just happen across, right? So there's no kind of history there, which I think you end up having views that are, even when the end result is that the rich owe a lot to the poor and, have to redistribute and so on, you take away the agency of the poor, first of all. You kind of treat them as sort of passive recipients of social justice. And also you run into all sorts of problems like, for a long time, global justice theorists were stuck in sort of debating between, does our world have the features of a society, of a sort of domestic society, such that we owe each other the same things as we would to our fellow citizens? But I think if you look at the history of empire and you look at how, for a long time, the world was already set up in a way that made a lot of things morally relevant. For example, if you look at the circulation of racist ideology and ideas about status, racialized status, then you can see that this idea of social equality isn't that far-fetched, that, the reason why it's morally relevant isn't that far-fetched. So I think that because of the ahistoricity of global justice, political theory, analytic political theory, it's led into these very abstract debates and ultimately misses a lot of global political life that can better be thought of if we see the world from a perspective of someone who's gone through, I think, one of the greatest global injustices in modern history.
That is colonialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, empire, yeah.
So the thought is something, so this is the thought that in political philosophy you treat it as if there's just these pools and children have wandered into them.
Yeah.
And you're sort of saying, no, there was a whole history of the world that set up the equivalent of the pools, the dangers and the issues that people are facing in these countries. And now we just pretend like it's happenstance. That's where we start from.
Yes, and then if we see, that a lot of those hierarchies and really, like problematic relationships still exist today, then it sort of we start from there rather than having to, first making an argument about how globalization has brought us together in ways that were previously not true before, which I always found very frustrating because, again, for most of the world's modern history, at least, we lived in empires. People lived in empires, not in nation states.
And so one of the things you're saying here as well is a shift away from thinking about it purely in distribution terms, so handing stuff out or back, and into this concern for hierarchy.
Yeah.
So what motivates that focus on hierarchy
in
particular, which is a slight move away from the kind of redistribution or even returning stolen goods and making reparations for the extraction of resources. You're drawing our attention to something slightly different here.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to what I was saying about why for these thinkers, like Fanon is the thinker I rely on the most in chapter 2, where I talk about this vision of global justice, post-colonial global justice as social equality. So for someone like him, it's the fact that there is material inequality itself is problematic because it creates these relationships that allow people to dominate, subjugate, humiliate, alienate others. And in so doing, creating two classes of human beings where in those terms, neither of them are really human in the sense that, one of them occupies a space where they think they're superior and they have a kind of distorted vision of the world. And, they are always living in fear because they are always worried that that the rest of the majority is going to come back at them and so on. And then you have this other category of people who are living subhuman lives. It's this relationship that is deeply problematic and that creates all sorts of things like constraints on people's freedom and so on and so forth. And it's the kind of relationship that I think still exists today in different forms globally. Yeah, so it's not enough to just think about inequality of distributions, but to think about the kind of relationships that those distributions create. And, beyond that as well, there are other things that are less so about material inequality and more about sort of, who is seen as and recognized as what I call a social agent or someone who is able to contribute to value making. And that also is part of a hierarchy when you have some people consistently or persistently seen as being inferior value makers. And I think that, again, like sort of drops out of the picture a bit if you only talk about how, there's the global poor and the global rich and so on.
So you're making us look towards hierarchy and questions of social equality. And so what you're doing here is you're creating a kind of positive vision of social equality that goes global. That's one of the major contributions to the book. Is that right? So in political philosophy, we've been talking for a long time about kind of domestic social equality, so social equality within a society.
Yeah.
And you're saying go global.
Yeah.
And you have this wonderful sketch of 3 different kinds of global hierarchies we see that social egalitarians should attend to. Would you give us a quick run through of the 3 main types that you highlight?
Yeah, so there's hierarchies of political power. And so, you think about the classic examples of global governance institutions. I mean, the UN is an obvious example, but, I talk about the WTO at length. All these institutions in which even when sometimes you have formal equality, there's actually obviously not real equality because some countries, just by virtue of their market power or the military power and so on and so forth, are able to dominate, to dictate what happens and so on. So that's one kind of hierarchy. And then another kind of hierarchy is what I call hierarchies of esteem or I guess status. So this is the idea that I just briefly talked about. So some people are seen as sort of more capable of creating what we recognize as value. We think about these narratives, like this might be a tangent, but like when Donald Trump visited the UK just a month ago or something, he talked about how the UK is like the country that created democracy, that brought to us all this like civilization and this wonderful literature. So the narratives like that, right? And whereas obviously he's referred to other countries as shithole places where, there's like, what did they ever do to power this world? So like this inequality of esteem, which I think is ultimately these hierarchies of esteem will sort of contribute to legitimizing other kinds of hierarchies. And then there's hierarchies of standing, which is this idea that some people's interests deserve greater consideration than others. So if you think about trade deals or unfair or investment deals that are exploitative, ultimately what that kind of arrangement says is that, it matters more that investors are able to enrich themselves than post-colonial citizens are able to secure their interests in flourishing life, for example. So yeah, those are the 3 kinds of hierarchies I talked about.
And as it transforms from a nation-specific or a domestic vision of justice into a global vision of justice, are we swapping from thinking about relations between particular people to thinking about relations between peoples or between nations? What are our kind of salient groupings now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the book, I talk about this. It's a very tricky issue. So I think ultimately because the view I come up with assumes that individuals are ultimately what I call well, not what I call, but like, I think what Rawls or many other philosophers call units of moral concern. So individuals are what matters, essentially. A group only matters insofar as they contribute to an individual's freedom and well-being. So ultimately what we want is a world where individuals are able to relate as equals. But in order to get there, we obviously ignore the fact that individuals are they move around the world in groups and we relate to each other often through each other's group identities. And so it's important then for people's, the various groups of which people belong to, either they're ascribed to by others or they subjectively identify with, for these groups to also be considered seen as equal. And the most obvious, when it comes to global politics is the sort of your national group, right? Or sometimes your racial group can be seen as a grouping as well, a politically salient grouping. And so that's why I talk about how, it's important for us to think about sort of the racialized hierarchies between post-colonial racialized groups and sort of the white global north and so on and so forth, and not enough to only talk about what individuals owe to each other.
Fascinating. Let's turn in the last section of this podcast to what you do in the second half of the book. So we get this wonderful, rich framework up, this new vision of global social equality, which is going to start talking about relations between nations and groups, but as a proxy for thinking about individual relations of social equality or a way to get at those. And then the second half of the book, you turn to apply this framework to a whole set of issues, some of which we've talked before about the podcast. So about things like cultural exports, economic systems. But today, let's talk about your theory's implications for global governance. So what are we doing wrong and how are we going to make it better from the point of view of global social equality?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess if you thought that an anti-colonial perspective wasn't only a nationalist perspective, you might think that the problem of global governance is that it interferes with national self-determination, right? You have all these international laws that nation states have to comply with and so on and so forth. But interestingly, and in this chapter I draw from Nehru, the problem of global governance isn't necessarily that it's interfering. In fact, he actively sought for and advocated for what he called a democratic world union. So he thought that, the problem with persistent world wars and the reason why countries are constantly trying to expand in the imperialist fashion, because ultimately there is such deep global inequality. And only by addressing that global inequality in a way that's democratic, then we can, in his words, once and for all resolve the root causes of war. And so for him, even in the, in the interwar period, he was already arguing for something like a world union, like a one world is another way that he puts it. But of course, he was not naive. He's a statesman after all, and he's very much a political actor. He thought that we needed to, first of all, address the fact that any kind of global institution that we come up with without addressing in some way, without alleviating global power inequality, was just going to be papering over these power inequalities and just ultimately going to lead to even more disillusionment for marginalized populations because we would see that these institutions basically are biased against them, right? So we think about standard critiques of many global institutions like the International Criminal Court, as only going after politicians of certain countries and so on and so forth. For Nehru, it's really important that we hold both things in our mind, in our head, right? On the one hand, the long-term goal is to have some kind of political integration at the global level. But on the other hand, we can't just naively get there by saying, okay, fine, let's have one country, one vote in this newly formed assembly or whatever, or let's have one citizen, one vote. And these are proposals that a lot of contemporary liberal political philosophers working on global constitutionalism have put forth, right? So people who argue for a world assembly or world constitution and so on. So I think someone like Nehru, if you take up an anti-colonial perspective of the kind I'm defending here, you might say that those are too quick, right? Too naive. So for Nehru, the middle ground is that in the here and now, before we can get to this union, we should, instead of abandoning this whole project, we should form counter-hegemonic political alliances. And this is where his lesser-known efforts in the interwar period to form what they called the League Against Imperialism comes from. is a transnational alliance of anti-imperialist activists. And then later on, when he became Prime Minister of India, obviously he was responsible for the Bandung movement, non-aligned movement, and so on and so forth, all these counter-hegemonic alliances between marginalized actors that were marginalized at that time, and in the aim of what he called instigating a psychological revolution. So like showing people that actually integration beyond your nation state can actually achieve some important goods. And then eventually when these alliances are able to win more concessions within global governance structures, then in a more kind of democratically reformed global governance structure, then there's hope for a more genuine kind of world union. So the anti-colonial perspective, I think, is able to show us why, on the one hand, we shouldn't sort of just give up on this aspiration of a more democratic kind of global governance, but on the other hand, why it's too naive to try to achieve that by just drawing up these blueprints for new kinds of constitutions and world assemblies and so on.
So the thought is first you start to create alternative power structures, then we go into the
Yeah.
center. Would you say that if that's all we did, there'd still be a danger of subverting the ultimate democratic government?
How do you mean?
So the thought I'm having is, so suppose there are these kind of groundswell movements, counter-imperialist projects.
Yeah.
And then that goes on for a while, these bonds are formed, there are these groupings, and then into the general system go the nation.
Yeah.
The thought I'm having is, won't there be enough residual power amongst the superpowers, at least, that you'll still get a similar kind of worry about the global hierarchies re-emerging, very rich, well-off, powerful nations doing better on any decision point?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's always a danger. So I guess, maybe departing from Nehru, I don't think that there's going to be an end point where we think, okay, we've achieved equality, political equality at the global level. So in the book, I talk about how it's really dependent on whether global governance moves towards democracy, and it's a constant process of moving towards that. It really depends ultimately on the actors that are marginalized at any given point, and not just states, but also non-state actors. So like sort of social movements and so on, whether they're able to mobilize in a way that threatens the material interests of whoever's sitting on top at that given moment. Today, it might still be the US, tomorrow it could be China or some configuration of those actors. And, I sort of look towards some contemporary social movements and how they are able to mobilize globally to subvert the material interests of these powerful actors. And so ultimately, I think it really depends on being able to do that. And as political philosophers or theorists, I think we should be turning towards thinking about the questions that arise when we think about political action at the global level, instead of, again, investing our energies in either just being skeptical of global democracy and just refuting it altogether, or kind of coming up with more clever institutional designs. Yeah.
Let's sneak in one last question about the method of this work.
Yes.
So your work's fascinating partly because it's bringing anti-colonial thinking into contact with analytic political philosophy, right? These people who are doing it wrong, who are thinking about ponds, who aren't seeing what we should be seeing.
Yeah.
What are pitfalls of doing that?
Yeah, there's many. And, I'm sure that I've stepped into all of them at one point or the other. So in the introduction, I talk at length about these potential pitfalls. So, one is just that, these are political actors. It's really hard to reconstruct from, some of them are more philosophical than others. Fanon's obviously a philosopher, but someone like Nehru, for example, it's really hard to reconstruct his political philosophies from his political actions, even though he did write extensively, but a lot of that is also very kind of specifically geared towards certain audiences. So part of it is just interpretive. That's the challenge. But I think the deeper challenge is, and people have said this many times to me, so is the fear that I might end up sort of using them as a mouthpiece to talk about my own views, which is not really true to what they might have thought. So, I hope I haven't done that. But it's true that the final view of global justice that I come up with is not recognizably a view that any of them held, but I think is consistent or compatible with the best reading of them, I think, of their commitments. So, for example, the fact that my view ultimately adopts normative individualism, one might think that that's in tension with anti-colonial thinkers who are often emphasizing things like collective empowerment and so on. I don't think that's inconsistent. And in the book, I sort of explain why, that we don't have to give up thinking about groups just because we think that, individuals are ultimately what matters, morally speaking. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the danger is that you come up with something that is not true to their core commitments. But I hope I haven't done that, even if on the way I've had to depart from some of their, I think, less core commitments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ying, for coming on and for letting us have a taste of some of the arguments that are in this book, which I highly recommend to our listeners to go and have a look at. So we've been discussing the book Post-Colonial Global Justice by Shuk-Ying Chan, just published by Princeton University Press. Full details, as ever, are in show notes for this episode, along with Ying's other discussions with us on other parts of her post-colonial global justice work. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of your time to rate or review us too. I'm Emily McTernan. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.